Hey everyone, this is a really tragic story about betrayal. Make sure to listen all the way to the end, leave a like, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. And now, let's begin. She pressed play and heard her own laughter coming from someone else's phone, so familiar it felt like someone had stolen her voice and placed it in another life. And in that moment she understood. Everything that seems solid can fall apart in a single second. But it had started long before that recording, long before that evening when he came home later than usual, put his phone face down on the nightstand, as if hiding its face. And she, with a small, bitter smile, decided that exhaustion had become the new religion of their marriage. She didn't ask questions anymore because questions had become dangerous. Every why in their house sounded like a tap on thin glass, fragile, ready to shatter. She lived among those cracks, stepped over them in the morning while making coffee, in the evening while setting the table, at night while listening to him turn to the other side, pretending to sleep. And she thanked the silence, because silence demanded no explanations. But one day, the silence found its own voice, through a recording of laughter, her laughter, saying yes to someone else's want to meet up. That yes cut like a knife with no handle, impossible to hold, impossible to forget. She stared at the screen and saw herself from the outside, playful, alive, a woman she no longer was at home. She tried to remember when it began. Maybe in the supermarket, when a stranger's gaze lingered on her fingers, choosing apples, and said, "Autumn looks beautiful on you." Or maybe at the office, when a new project brought in people who didn't know her old self, and one of them, with a voice that seemed to unwrap her silence, asked, "What did you dream of becoming before you learned to be convenient?" She laughed then, truly laughed, for the first time in months. That laugh would later become a recording. Between that laugh and that recording were days, weeks, short messages that began with, "How are you?" and ended late at night when everyone was asleep except her thoughts. She told herself it was harmless, just a game of boundaries that she only missed feeling seen. Standing in the soft glow of someone's attention that didn't judge, didn't compare, didn't demand. But the more she explained it away as just, the harder it became to call things by their names. Because words can cheat too. And she had been unfaithful long before the act itself. Every nothing to her husband instead of "I'm scared." Every "I'm fine" instead of "I'm drowning." Every "we'll talk tomorrow" instead of "talk to me now, before I disappear." And she was disappearing, like an autumn leaf drifting into someone else's warmth, where she was listened to completely, where someone noticed how she held her cup and asked why she always sat with her back to the window. "Because this way," she said, "you don't see the light leaving." And he laughed, not her husband, but the other one, and told her, "Darkness doesn't suit you." And she believed him, because it's easier to believe you're being brought back to life than to admit you walked away from it yourself. And yet, there were signs in her home, traces she left behind like white sand, hoping her husband would see them, stop her, hold her tighter than her fear, and say just one thing: "I know you're slipping away. Don't go." But he didn't. He joked about deadlines, exhaustion, gas prices, and when she asked, "Do you hear me?" he said, Yeah, later." As if later was a place where love stored things for better days. So she started meeting for coffee, then for 10 minutes, then for half an hour, "I'll make it," until time stopped being measured in minutes and began being measured in heartbeats, because with him, her heart ran, and at home, it stood still. One day she came home early, to an empty apartment that smelled of clean laundry and stale silence. And she realized there's nothing louder than the emptiness in a closet, when a stranger's shirt hangs closer to her dresses than her husband's hands to her shoulders. She took out her phone and wrote, "I'm scared." but she didn't send it to her husband. She sent it to the one who knew how to read between the lines. He came quickly, as if he'd been waiting all his life at the corner, sat on the edge of her kitchen table and asked, "What do you need?" And she wanted to answer, "Home." But instead she said, "You." Because home isn't walls. It's the place where you don't have to hide your eyes. And when that place no longer exists, you start replacing it with people. That evening, she crossed the line she had been tracing for weeks, like a child tracing their hand on paper, thinking it was just a line. But the line turned out to be a door, and behind it was warmth that smelled like risk. She came home late, tiptoed in, undressed silently, and lay down next to her husband, listening to him breathe. Steady, as if nothing had happened. And that as if had been living in their marriage for years. Both pretending everything was fine, because fine felt safer than truth. But truth has a way of surfacing, in broken morning glances, in awkward pauses, in his fingers reaching for his phone before her hand. And when everything finally came out, yes, because of that very recording, her laugh saved in someone else's chat, she couldn't believe it was that which became the trigger. There had been other signs, the lingering sense of unfamiliar perfume, the pauses heavy with someone else's, "I missed you." But nothing is louder than your own voice, spoken for the wrong ears. He stood by the window, holding the phone like a match to a fuse, and said nothing. His silence was new, heavy, not from exhaustion, but from recognition. He didn't ask, "Who is he?" Because names don't heal anything. He asked only one question. "When did you become someone else?" And she wanted to answer, "When you stopped looking for me." But she knew that was only half the truth. The other half was, "When I stopped looking for you." They sat across from each other like two people who still remembered the same language, but had forgotten the words. Each waited for the other to speak first, to break down, to beg. But neither could. He went into their son's room, brushed his hair gently, while she stood by the table, whispering to herself that she'd explain everything tomorrow. Tomorrow. The safest place to hide the truth. But the truth came first. Packed in a suitcase by the door with a note that read, "I don't know who you are anymore, and because of that I don't know who I am next to you." She didn't stop him, because you can stop a body, but not a leaving. The days after stretched slow, like wet laundry hanging without sunlight. Work. Silence. Messages from the man who once felt like light, now just a hallway lamp. Switching on when it's dark, but never warm. She realized cheating doesn't save anyone. It only exposes the cracks you've both been ignoring. Her world shrank to two voices, hers and the echo. She tried to build a life out of "I'll eat first, then think," out of "I'll finish this project, then cry." But tears are like rain. They don't follow schedules. One day the other man said, "I don't want to be your escape from your home." And for the first time, she heard that even in understanding, there can be boundaries. She sat in the cafe where it had all begun and watched people share pizza, laugh, a boy asking his mom for a sip of coffee like the grown-ups. And she realized being grown up isn't about secrets. It's about courage. The courage not to run away. That evening, she dialed her husband's number, not expecting him to answer. But he did. She said, "I'm not calling to justify myself. I just want to confess." And she talked for a long time, not defending, not attacking, saying all the things they had stretched across years of silence. "I was scared. I was angry. I was disappearing. I'm guilty." He listened. Sometimes breathing heavier, sometimes whispering, "Why didn't you say this earlier?" And she didn't know how to explain that earlier is a country with no return tickets. They agreed to meet, not to fix things, but to look each other in the eye and call everything by its name. In the park, where they once hid from the rain under one scarf, they walked side by side and were silent. The kind of silence that comes from too many words. He said, "I don't know how to hate you, but I've learned how to live without you." And she replied, "I've learned how to live with myself honestly." It was an invisible point, a new map's beginning, not together, but without war. At home, she took off her ring and placed it in a box, not like a grave, but like an archive. Memories should be kept, not to rule over you, but to remind you. To the other man, she wrote a short message. "Thank you for the light that wasn't mine." Then she closed the chat, one filled with 1,000 words, none of which felt like home. She began to speak out loud where she once stayed silent. "I want, it hurts, I need to talk, I need you." Not to anyone in particular, but to the world that could finally hear her without recordings. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, her own laughter would wake her, that same laugh once stolen by a phone. But now it didn't cut. It reminded her, a voice is something you take back yourself. And months later, when she and her husband met again at their son's school play, she saw him in the stage light and thought, love doesn't have to last forever to be real. He walked over, asked if she was cold, and offered his scarf, the same one. And in that simple gesture was the warmth they couldn't handle back then. They stood together watching their son play a tree, still strong, and she suddenly realized the affair hadn't been a fall. It was a sign of exhaustion they both ignored. Now she named things. If silence was a wall, she knocked. If pain was the wind, she learned to stand. If love was a road, she walked it, not by memory, but by the map she was drawing now. And maybe one day on that map, there would be a home again, a place where laughter carries no guilt, where questions don't sound like blows, where phones lie face up because there's nothing inside them more interesting than living eyes. She pressed delete recording and felt for the first time that she wasn't reclaiming the past. She was reclaiming her right not to hide. And as she left the room, she wrote one last word on the table. Not for him, not for the other man, but for herself. Enough.